Today I am talking with my friend David in what I hope will be a regular feature where I just try to speak to people from my community to gain an idea of their thoughts and experiences. David and I know each other from Ipswich, but we probably became friends in Sheffield where we both went to university, and we've both got a lot in common and share a common passion in football. And David, you watched my video earlier in the week about Tommy Robinson and wanted to mention that, didn't you? What were your thoughts on Tommy Robinson's views in general?
Yeah, thanks, though. It's good to catch up, mate. Just want to be clear that, I'm not here trying to be, voice of the black people and leader of the charge. I'm doing this out of my love for you and because I really support what it is you're trying to do. I'm not an expert in black history or civil rights, but I can share my opinions and some of my experiences. And if that helps to add a little bit of context and understanding for somebody, then, or for you or anybody else, then, that's enough of a win for me.
Cool.
But yeah, I've watched your videos and listened to what you had to say on Tommy Robinson. And I agree with most of what you're saying. Tommy Robinson, whether we like it or not, is a very influential person, has built up a big following. But when it comes to his analysis of the Black Lives Matter movement, I really think he's missing the point and he's focusing on the wrong things. And what I mean by that is, the whole escalation of the Black Lives Matter movement did stem from the police killing of a black man in broad daylight in front of the whole world to see. I think we can all agree on that. But what it's led to now is for people to take a deeper look at their own understanding of race and institutional racism and white privilege. So what did start out as a stand in solidarity with black people in America has led to a much broader conversation and bigger movement where people just want to live in a fairer society. I think, if Tommy Robinson really wants to become an expert on the Black Lives Matter movement, then he also has to gain a deeper understanding of what the movement actually means and what it is people are striving for and fighting for. The point you made about Tommy mainly using videos and examples from America is a brilliant point, because you've got an ever-growing group of people that are saying we have a problem with institutional racism in the UK. And for me, that's what the conversation needs to be focused on, because that's what matters more to us. That's what affects our lives, and that's what we can affect, really. And it's because Tommy Robinson is so influential and has such a large following that we should be really careful with, or he should be really careful with the information that he's putting out there. Because it can be really dangerous. You only have to look at last week and the number of his supporters that went down to London to protect the statues, which led to 100 arrests and a lot of people getting badly hurt. And he's got a lot to do with that.
So it goes without saying almost that racism is definitely a part of our country. And one thing we have in common, which I mentioned, is football. And probably different experiences ourselves. So what are your thoughts and experiences on racism in football in the UK?
Okay. So I think the way that racism plays out in football is very indicative of the way that racism plays out in society in general, and more specifically British society. There are a small number of people involved in football that, be that players, coaches, local county and Sunday league players that will be, quite overtly racist. We spoke about this recently, and, you told me that there's been times where you would have heard someone in the crowd or in a pub refer to a player as a black cunt. There's also been a handful of times where I've been playing football and have been called a black cunt or black bastard or whatever. The most recent time I encountered it was when I was playing for Ransoms 5 or 6 years ago against Brantford, and one of the Brantford players called my brother Vinny a black cunt because he fouled him. So it still happens, but I don't think it's rife throughout football in general. The majority of people that play, watch, or are involved in football wouldn't think it's okay to, openly label someone as a black cunt. That doesn't mean it's okay just because it's only a few people, but because that's still a few people too many. But I think we should be careful not to brandish all football fans as racist and, you know, start to alienate large groups of people based on the actions of a few. But, you know, that being said, I do personally feel a little bit uncomfortable and out of place when I go to watch football or go to the pubs around the football grounds. And, you know, and I do feel like that because I'm not white and British. That could be my own paranoia or that could be a more general feeling amongst like other people. I don't know. I think I know why or when I started to feel like that, though. Like when I was younger and the World Cup was on, you know, I used to get well into it. I've had my face painted with an English flag and sung 10 German bombers in the air and England till I die and all the rest of it. And, you know, I love it. It's a buzz. But there is, you know, one song that gets sung that makes me feel well uncomfortable. And that is Rule Britannia. You know, Britannia rule the waves. Britain will never be slaves. And I used to sing that song in the pub when I was younger. And, you know, before I understood, you know, what the actual words in that song were, and then what that meant for me. And, you know, as I start to learn more about myself and how I became to be British, I realised that, you know, I really shouldn't be singing that song because my own ancestors were slaves, you know. And what that song is basically saying is that we're British and we're powerful because no one can enslave us. Which, of course, the other side of that is if you're not British and you were enslaved, that means you're weak and below us. So when I say that, I'm not just going off on a tangent, you know. You know, when I say that racism in football mirrors racism in society, then the meaning of that song plays into how racism works in society, because there are countless you know, little nuances and subtleties and jokes that are played out in the media that play into that narrative of, you know, if you're not truly British, you're not truly powerful, you know, you're not really one of us. So that's why I think it like matters. But keeping it, you know, football related itself, it'll be interesting to see what leadership in football starts to look like over the next 10 or 15 years. You know, as in every other aspect of society, you know, there's an ever increasing representation of black and mixed race footballers. And, you know, also as in every other aspect of society, black and mixed race people are underrepresented in leadership positions. You know, so that's captains, you know, coaches, directors, etc., etc. Terry Connor did an interview recently and said that he did some work with the England under-21s after leaving Ipswich. Pardon me, or after leaving Ireland, I can't remember. But anyway, so he did a bit of work with the England under-21s, and 65% of that squad were black and mixed race. However, he was the only one out of 22 backroom staff that wasn't white. So there's a clear, I don't know, there's a big difference between, you know, who's actually playing the game and who's running the game and help to teach the game.
Yeah, that could be a generational thing though as well. I mean, maybe there were fewer black footballers in 20 years ago, so you'd think that maybe in 10 years' time, like you say, because there's more black British footballers playing for us in this generation, in the next 10, 15 years, we should hope you see these come through into background roles and management staff.
Yeah, you know, that's what you'd hope to see for sure. And, you know, that's why it'll be interesting to see kind of how it plays out. And, you know, I'm not an expert on this and, you know, I'd have to do my own reading and review of the information before I could come to any real conclusions on why I think black people are so underrepresented in these leadership positions. But I do think the fact that, you know, the subject matter experts, you know, being black and mixed race people involved in the football industry, you know, are constantly crying out and trying to highlight the problem of institutionalized racism in football. I think it definitely warrants some, you know, some further investigation. And And rather than, people just shutting it down and labeling people as whingers and coming to the conclusion that black coaches aren't good enough and are asking for a free ride, we as people, we should be given the opportunity to review whatever information is available to us before we can, make a real judgment call on how deep the problem is.
Yeah, cool. So taking a step back from football, and I think this is where it can get a bit blurry for some people, is the deeper rooted racism problem in the UK. Is it time to talk about the issue, whether it's due to race or class?
I think that is a common argument for a lot of people. The fact that, black people aren't the only disadvantaged group in society. And, I think it's a fair one. The gap between rich people and poor is always increasing. And, that affects white people, it affects black people, it affects the immigrant population as a whole. There are a lot of poor white people in England, and purely based on the imbalance of the amount of white people in England versus the amount of black people in England, there are more poor white people in England than there are poor black people in England. In Ipswich, we don't have the same levels of poverty as the major cities, but you only have to walk around some of the streets in working class areas such as Greenwich or Napton or Whitton. Even, a little bit of Rushmere to see that there are plenty of families living below the poverty line. I think in Ipswich, there are more white people in most of these areas than there are black people. It's quite obvious, and, the statistics will probably show you that as well. But I think what's more important to look at is the proportion of black and mixed race people relative to the amount of black and mixed race people in an area. That's where you start to realise the overrepresentation of black people in poor areas. And due to the relatively low number of black and mixed race people in somewhere like Ipswich, it skews the numbers a little bit, but the argument still stands. And when you apply that same analysis to London and the bigger cities, the case becomes more obvious in that black and mixed race people are overrepresented in poor inner city areas. And that doesn't take away from the fact that poor white people are there, that the fact that there are poor white people as well. It's just an interesting one. Are black people disadvantaged because of race, or is it purely because of class? So it's a real interesting conversation. But even taking into account the fact that black people are overrepresented in lower class areas, it's not enough to simply say that society's problems are due to class inequality alone. The struggles of race and the struggles of class aren't separate; they're linked and very much intertwined. I also think it's important before we really get into it that we make sure we use working class in the correct context, because there are a lot of people that identify as being working class when in fact they're not. These are people that work a decent job, their missus has got a job, they have a mortgage, they're no longer working class. That's middle class, lower middle class maybe, but you might have working class values and come from a working class background. You don't drive around in a brand new Mercedes. Your kids don't go to private school, but you're not part of a disadvantaged group in society. You get on and you get by. When I was at university, we learned about upper class, middle class, and working class. Newer studies will talk about there being 7 different class groups and classifications. But no matter what definition you're using, black and mixed race people are always overrepresented in the lowest class group. And I also learned about the concept of the underclass. And when I'm talking about disadvantaged groups in society, these are really the people that I'm talking about. People that are on the dole, work very people on the dole all work very low-paid jobs. Live in council housing. Kids are on free school dinners. You're living below the poverty line and you struggle to get by. That's a disadvantaged group I'm talking about when I'm talking about working class. But
I think that might be why, like I say, is people are some people aren't convinced by the Black Lives Matter movement because they see it as an issue of class as opposed to race. So all of these awful disadvantages that we talk about also affect white people. But it's not really the case, because they might be two separate issues, but like you say, they're very related and intertwined issues. So it's, generally speaking, white people are more likely to be born into a family that had the opportunity to gain centuries of generational wealth than you are if you're a black person. If you're born a black person, you're essentially got a much higher chance of being born into the lower class group.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you are born black or mixed race in Britain, it's very likely you'll be born into a home that your family doesn't own. So in that sense, you're starting from the bottom. And the way that society is structured, it makes it more difficult for black people to achieve upwards mobility. It's not to say it can't be done, but it just makes it a bit more difficult. But there are plenty of poor white people in this unfair society that we live in that aren't cared about. Poor white people aren't cared about in a similar way that poor black people aren't cared about. You'll never see an article in a national newspaper talking about white on white crime on a poor council estate in somewhere like Newcastle, but you will see an article in a national newspaper talking about black on black crime. And in terms of the poor white people in England, the system starts to tell you that you're white working class, and by system I mean the media, government, and in turn large corporations. And it's the whiteness, it's the addition of the whiteness to your working class position in society that leads people to believe that they are being disadvantaged and treated unfairly because they are white, right? Like hear me out. An example of what you might see in the papers is schools must focus on improving white working class attainment, right? And don't get me wrong, I agree with that in the sense that all people, regardless of colour, should be treated fairly and be given the resources they need to improve their living situation. But the narrative gets spun in a way that the failings of the white working class happen because there is a lack of government support, lack of good social housing, etc., because it's being spent on immigrants, and traditionally it's been black and Asian people. Now it's also Eastern Europeans, Albanians, and Romanians. They're taking our jobs, they're taking our homes. So there's not enough left for us. And
before black people, it was Irish people. So there's always been a step.
Exactly right, and you're exactly right. Black people weren't the first group of people that were treated this way. Before black people, it was Irish people. And the media and the government will reinforce this narrative, and people lap it up and start to project their frustrations on non-white British people, which is an absolute deflection from the real agenda at play, which is we live in an unfair society and the government doesn't care about poor people, white or otherwise. Racial stereotypes are reinforced to demonize certain groups in society, like black and Asian people, used to be Irish people, now it's Eastern Europeans, Romanians, and Albanians. The status quo remains intact, and poor people fight amongst each other, and government continues to go about its business of making them and their mates feel filthy rich. The class struggle and the race struggle don't exist independently. They're very intertwined, and whilst the working class struggle is whilst the white working class struggle is very much the same as the black working class struggle, white working class people aren't subjected to the same treatment in the media and by the government, which serves to pit one group of working class people against another. And racism is a deep rooted, extremely complex subject. And the dictionary definition of racism doesn't give it anywhere near the attention and justice that it deserves and that it needs.
Thanks for your time. I found that really insightful. Really appreciate it. Before you go, do you have any advice for anybody who wants to help the Black Matters cause but isn't sure where to start?
Just read. Read a Carlisle Natives, order it on Kindle or on Audible, and just listen to what he has to say. I don't think there's any way that you can reach a conclusion on your own ideas of racism before trying to understand what it really is and what racism really is. So I think you should either teach yourself what racism is and what it really means, or you shouldn't really be discussing it. That's not only directed at white people. That's everybody. That's myself. Everybody included.
Cool. Thanks so much.
All good. Good to chat to you, mate. And hopefully you got something out of that. And if someone else does, then awesome.
Yeah, I definitely did, mate. And I'm sure other people will too. Have a good evening.
All right, brother. Take care, mate.
See you, pal.